there is some social solidarity to be found in surveillance critique. How do we do things like seek algorithmic justice or data justice? Is good surveillance possible at all? I think some of you are skeptical about that, and I'm sometimes skeptical too. Could it relate to what I was saying in the first lecture about the eye of God? Well, that's another good question. So what are the prospects for the future of surveillance and the role of universities and university courses within the politics of surveillance? And I think of what we're trying to do in the course and this evening as retrieving a role for informed public debate in an era of disinformation, which comes right back to your question again. So thanks for the question. I hope there will be others. I don't intend to talk for a really long time anyway, so there should be plenty of time for our discussions together. Just wanted to make a comment or two that relates or fills in some details relating to last night's talk when I was discussing Israel-Palestine and the war in Gaza. It's really important to understand the historical background to the use of high-tech surveillance and military techniques, for that matter, in Israel. It's also important to underscore the ways in which belief and trust in new technologies encourage insufficiently self-critical uses of AI surveillance. And what I didn't really say last night was, well, how did that Hamas attack on October 7 work? What made it succeed? Basically, it was surprise. It was a surprise attack, unanticipated by the Israelis. The whole of the border between Gaza and Israel is very heavily guarded. And there are numerous checkpoints and cameras and remotely controlled machine guns, robot machine guns. They're all along the border. So how did they manage to get through that and perpetrate their attack, which, as I said last night, was a horrible attack, although it has to be said that some aspects of the attack weren't as bad as some media accounts have made out, particularly the ones relating to sexual abuse and so on. I was reading just today about how some of those simply were not true. So it was awful, and there's no other way of talking about it, but some of the things weren't quite as awful as some newspapers made us believe. So it was the surprise element. And it seems that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, believe their own propaganda and hype about their Iron Dome, protection from rockets, from Gaza, and the much acclaimed Wolfpack biometric system. It is, in terms of security, it's one of the biggest and most complex systems in the world. It seems never to have occurred to the Israelis and to IDF in particular that Hamas could launch an unexpected attack by the simple means of not using the internet in their plans and their preparations. They found several ways of not using digital devices that would have given their game away. Hamas did use drones of their own to disable cameras all along the border. They were low flying, so they weren't images of them weren't captured by the Israelis. And likewise, they could disable the robot machine guns. They used motorbikes and other non-military vehicles to cross the border. And of course, they don't have military vehicles anyway, but they were using all kinds of means to cross the border once they had defused everything that could have impeded their project at the border. A desperate people, I guess, will use all methods at their disposal. Not to mention their own non-artificial intelligence to attack them, the people who keep them in an open prison, that is Gaza. Interestingly, even the low-tech warnings from Israeli intelligence, the Tatzpitaniyot operators. Tatzpitaniyot are operators who are working for the IDF in low-grade intelligence. So there are people that are looking at the screens to see what might be trying to cross the border, or they're watching out for suspicious activities, but they're human watchers. Tatzpitaniyot. So they're known as spotters or lookouts, and almost all of them are women. And a number of them, for almost a year, had been reporting on unusual activity on the Gaza side of the border. Almost a year, they had been saying there's strange things going on. They saw mock attacks, kind of practice attacks. They saw Hamas testing their means of avoiding checkpoints, of practicing with scale models of Israeli machine gunner bunkers. So there were signs that were seen by the Tatzpitaniyot, the spotters, who were women. And a number of these female soldiers have complained subsequently that no one listened to them. All the senior officers in the IDF are men, and they were unwilling to hear what these women were telling them. And the female soldiers have complained about what they call gross sexism in refusing to listen to the stories that they were telling to the Israeli IDF officers. And you could ask whether such sexism was actually at least partially to blame for the loss of, well, now 31,200 lives, including the Israeli lives. We'll probably speculate on that forever, but it's pretty sobering to think that they actually had the means of knowing, and it was low tech, women watching, and made no difference. And the first source of that information about the activities of the women and their not being listened to comes from an Israeli source. It was Haaretz newspaper, which is a pretty reliable Israeli newspaper. It was Haaretz that first reported on what those women soldiers told them. It was subsequently reported in the West and, well, around the world. But it first came out in Haaretz. And I think we see here in that Israeli IDF belief in their high-tech system and its complete foolproof, we can do anything with this technology, it keeps us safe. This is kind of blind belief in the centrality of technique, the Jacques Ellul notion that technique has become so central to modern culture. A new US report from a reliable source shows that there is a high degree of skepticism about the benefits of AI in and surveillance. This report, as you see, came out today, unmistakably, because it's February the 29th and doesn't happen except every 4 years. So this is American, and it's an American report, but it's from pretty, again, reliable researchers. The person who was the key author of it is someone who for years used to work for, what do they call it? The Pew, anyway, Pew, it's P-E-W. And now she works for Elon University in Carolina. And look at it. What is the first worry that, the first and biggest worry that American citizens have about surveillance in the 21st century? Privacy. 66%. Far more negative than positive. And you can see the somewhat negative is a pretty tiny category in the mustard color there. And then it goes through other areas of AI impacts. But I just thought it was interesting that it came out today, and I thought I'd share it with you just because it fit with what we were saying, rather more dramatically than I put it yesterday. People's opportunities for employment is the next biggest. People's relationship with others. If we're talking human-centered, a lot of American citizens seem to have it right. Relational. And then basic human rights, which of course can be connected with privacy, because, as I've tried to explain, privacy is a rather narrow way of thinking about what might be wrong with, or what might be an antidote to surveillance. Anyway, I just thought I'd show you that. There's another report that came out today from an Indian group in Bangalore, and they are worrying about the World Trade Organization, which is currently meeting, and this week. And what they're concerned about is, again, the sorts of things that relate to your question, the capacity of the new technologies to give completely false information, misinformation, disinformation, polarized information. I mean, this is the world that we live in. And of course, it impacts surveillance. It has a role in relation to surveillance and surveillance data. So the Indian report is worried about the World Trade Organization, saying that they are not nearly alert enough to the dangers of deep fakes. And they cite the Taylor Swift deep fakes that have been occurring over the past few weeks, and also the Joe Biden robocalls that have been occurring over the last, so it's very recent news, and they're very concerned that these kinds of things are not being properly addressed by the World Trade Organization. They also, in this report, note that having the Silicon Valley giants, as they call them, in the steering committee of the World Trade Organization, quote, bodes ominously for public accountability. Have I been stressing quite a lot? That there is a need for public accountability in all these surveillance systems. It's not enough to just talk about privacy or give lip service to privacy, not enough to talk about transparency, because those things are just the backdrop to the really important thing, which is the accountability of organizations that do surveillance. And as I'm aware, several of you are in are studying law, and of course we're in the law faculty, so it's very relevant to your work as well as mine. However, the Indian report comments on the ways in which the European Union in particular has shown good example of trying at least to make appropriate legislation in relation to surveillance in general, AI, and so on. They talk about the AI Act that is just being worked through in Europe, in the European Union, and the Digital Services Act, which are offering some binding norms. And some other countries are trying to emulate what the European Union has already done. So they set an example, which is good. However, the Indian report points out that with 2 new Gen AI launches this month, on the one hand, Google's Gemini, and 2, OpenAI's Sora, the pace of development and availability of such systems is growing very fast indeed. And they tend to be launched before, well, because they love to be first, whoever it is, they love to have the first system out on the market, because especially if they're Google, they will believe that the first there is also going to be the most successful and therefore the most profitable for the giant corporation. So anyway, it just struck me as interesting that I opened up my machine today and I find there's 2 reports that directly relate to the kind of stuff that we're doing, and each of them is raising some really good questions. One based on survey work and the other based on reporting on what the World Trade Organization is discussing currently. So how do we move in this area? We do have privacy laws around the world. We do have data protection laws, especially in Europe. And myself, I think that legal instruments are of the essence. It's really important that we do develop legal instruments while there are still countries around the world that believe in law. And inappropriate, excessive, and illegal surveillance have developed more slowly in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but expanding hugely with 21st century computerization and digitization. And such privacy and data protection laws are the backbone of government efforts to curtail and govern surveillance. They're based on the idea that citizens have rights respecting personal data, whether it's called privacy or not, and they represent a steady and persistent means of regulating surveillance, affecting government, corporate, and law enforcement activities. The intrinsic protections, whether they're called privacy or data protection, are important, but they also act as an important vehicle for other basic democratic rights, such as freedom of assembly, speech, and belief, and protection from discrimination. All these things play into legal measures to limit surveillance. And if there's another theme that has come across in all that I've been saying, it's that surveillance is today, and always has been in the modern era, to do with social sorting. It's a matter of categorizing so that different groups in the population can be treated differently. And you know, it's one thing to talk about my privacy. It's another to talk about the ways in which our societies are divided, in part by distinctions made by surveillance systems. Data breaches, subtle cyber warfare, state surveillance overreach aren't just vague threats. They occur with increasing regularity. And their effects on vulnerable populations are huge. They menace both democracy and public trust. And as I say, I make no apologies for talking about public trust. I think trust is a critical feature of all societies. Without trust, societies collapse. So governments working towards making laws to try to limit the kinds of surveillance that occur is great. But what about if users themselves, roused by campaigns perhaps, begin a concerted effort to rein in and redirect the activities of such huge corporations? Now, my colleague in Canada, Colin Bennett, he's a political scientist, has shown in his book on resisting surveillance that this has never had the kind of public cachet. It's never had kind of popular enthusiasm, and it doesn't have any Greta Thunberg to lead it either. The movements against negative climate change are much more amenable to group protests and actions, partly because people can see them so much more readily in their own countries with changing weather patterns and so on and so forth. Surveillance is so much more subtle, and it's hard to really get a handle on what is happening in the surveillance world. So for various reasons, it's hard to think of large-scale social movements that relate to surveillance and the opposition to or the limits on surveillance. However, the sorts of things that today's report from Elon University shows is that there's a whole bunch of people in the US anyway who are very unenthusiastic about what's going on in the world of surveillance. And I suspect that if similar surveys were done in other parts of the world, we'd find something rather similar to that. They are gradually coming to be seen as highly significant. And of course, many well-informed privacy advocates and activists from civil society have learned to use significant media, which may help in the process of trying to educate people about what is going on in the surveillance world. But as yet, there isn't a coherent international movement that speaks to surveillance issues. I mean, way back in 2012, for example, there was a Declaration of Internet Freedom signed by many prominent figures in the name of a free and open internet. And among other things, it was quite opposed to surveillance. And it had a lot of Brazilian signatories to the Declaration of Internet Freedom a long time ago. And a lot of people who were known in the arena of questioning surveillance were signatories to that. So the person who made the film about Edward Snowden, Laura Poitras, did you ever see Citizen 4? Okay, that's a really good film. I actually brought a DVD along with me just in case we would have time to show it, but we didn't. But it's really worth looking it up. Citizen 4 is the best film about Edward Snowden's work. There's another film called just Snowden, and it's not nearly as good. not least because it's made by Laura Poitras, and she was one of the two journalists that Snowden invited to report on what he was doing on the day that he took records from the NSA. He asked her to be a journalist who would spread news, accurate news about what he had done. And so she was there with her camera from the very first day after they met in Hong Kong. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting story, that one too. We don't have time to go into all such things. But yeah, Tim Berners-Lee and Vincent Cerf and Ai Weiwei, groups such as Amnesty International, and yeah, lots of professors at leading universities also joined in with that declaration on internet freedom. So, related matters. A few days ago, I made some comments about citizen subjects in relation to surveillance and other matters of internet practice. The authors are Engin Ishin and Evelyn Ruppert, and they argue, as I think I said, that citizens aren't just subject to power, but they're also subjects of power. And they're the ones that develop the theory about, what's really a very practical theory about being digital citizens. And of course, people who take on the task of being digital citizens may suffer at the hands of the law. Think of the decentralized and international hacktivist group Anonymous. But the point is that they're making claims about rights to internet freedom, including freedom from unnecessary, disproportionate, or illegal surveillance by government or corporations. Unfortunately, a lot of digital rights people don't always speak of citizenship, but they reduce these problems to what they call individuals. And I think that's regrettable, because if you talk about citizenship, it's something that you share with other people. If you talk about just individuals, then the idea that you work in concert with others is less obvious. To capitulate to the conclusion, which is often around, that we're incapable of questioning surveillance, of contesting surveillance, is to deny, I think, some of our crucial human capacities. There are things that can be done, and the issues raised by surveillance can, and I think should, be addressed in a range of ways. There's no one right way. But joining the movements to question surveillance, I think, are very worthwhile. In our century, while everyday surveillance can be relatively benign and socially beneficial, I've never argued against that, the accelerating shift towards the digital, propelled by both governments and corporations, has prompted a rapidly growing chorus of voices expressing concern about the evident downsides of several kinds of surveillance. Worries about where the sensitive data might travel, to public outcry about very poor handling of data, does make other people conscious that there are issues out there. So many will ask the question, well, what can we do? This surveillance is a reality built into the very structure of today's world. If we talk surveillance capitalism, we're talking about something that is infrastructural. Our world now depends upon surveillance for its everyday functioning. The difficulties of living in our world of smartphone and video camera surveillance vary considerably, as do the ways to deal with them. In everyday life, there are many uncertainties about surveillance. Is my young daughter endangered by my posting pictures of her online? What exactly is my boss monitoring when I work remotely? And the seemingly trivial, in some cases, becomes seriously troubling when lifted out of the original context. Inappropriate or compromising comments or photos, details about race, age, religion, pregnancy, disability can affect life chances and choices, which is pretty straightforward to grasp. On the other hand, the fact that your drugstore, your pharmacy, has discount cards, and with it they collect data about you. Drugstores, remember, pretty sensitive areas for data collection. Those data become part of a profile once the drugstore has a handle on them through your loyalty card. And they may, from those data, rate your chances without ever knowing that your chances are being rated of contracting some disease, or they might try to sell you some service, or more awkwardly, if it's an insurance company, refuse to offer benefits because your case is construed as too risky. So all sorts of things could happen that you don't really think about when you just go into a drugstore to purchase something. You may try to, instinctively hide. You might try to cover your tracks. Well, yeah. Smudging fingerprints or turning away from the camera, or doing other things like that are individual responses, but they're relatively trivial. They're not going to do much, and they're certainly not going to do what strong laws relating to surveillance could do. From reading some sources, you could be forgiven that the big story of surveillance is one of limits on freedom, constraints on living, hegemonic control. Michel Foucault's work sometimes gives that impression if you read that theorist. But he also insists that, quote, where there is power, there is resistance. And I think maybe I mentioned him, another French intellectual, Michel de Certeau, takes this further. How, he asks, do people resist being, as he calls it, reduced to the grid of discipline? He urges that we spend time considering what popular procedures manipulate the mechanisms of discipline and conform to them only in order to evade them. So he talks about micro practices that, if done together, could make a difference. And it will be encouraging when you discover that there are other people who are in the same situation as you, who are also worried, anxious, angry, irritated with certain kinds of surveillance. And that realization that other people are concerned can help to turn what may seem like a personal problem into a public issue. And I think it's worth thinking about all the ways in which that could happen. To bring questions to appropriate authorities yields opportunities for more collaborative approaches. The individual approach is all very well, and it might make you feel good, but it's unlikely to do much unless you're joining with other people to raise questions. Now, you asked a question about Edward Snowden, and there he is. Snowden was a very ordinary citizen. He was engaged as a member of the US military in activities that related to data in national security. He was young. He was, yeah, but at the same time, he was a loyal American citizen. And those who complained when back in whenever it was 2013, he collected some data that was that was not data intended for a public audience. He took data from the NSA and walked out of the NSA buildings carrying that data. And he was to indicate to the world, really, that the NSA was fundamentally, what's the word? Well, contravening their mandate, which was to collect data on non-American citizens. It was meant as a collection of data on those who were not American citizens. And he showed incontrovertible evidence that, in fact, the NSA was collecting huge files on American citizens as well as foreigners. I think people often thought, what a nerve to take those records out of the NSA, and why did he just do it so spontaneously? Well, the answer is it wasn't spontaneous. He'd been planning it for a long time. And he had been confronting his senior officers with the evidence that he had found. So it wasn't just a spontaneous action, that it was the result of months of being very anxious that the National Security Agency was not doing what its mandate gave it to do. So it was as a loyal American citizen, not an anti-American citizen who deserved to be, well, in the end, having to live as an exile outside the US, which he's done ever since. It was as a loyal American citizen that he did this. If you read his book, and if you watch the Laura Poitras film, you can see this guy was seriously American in ways that I frankly find quite hard to, imagine. He was much more of a loyal citizen and doing what he did out of a loyal citizen position, and a member of the American military too. Anyway, he was an ordinary guy who got into surveillance activities as somebody seriously concerned about security in the US, and he realized that his employers were inappropriately targeting ordinary US citizens. Now, you and I do not have the opportunities that Edward Snowden had to do something that would be world-changing. I'm not pretending that we do. However, it's interesting that someone who had a pretty low sense of his own importance and was just trying to do what he thought was the right thing would have such a huge impact. But people do work for organizations, and many organizations that we work for are surveillant. Ordinary workers in numerous contexts, including, I should say, universities, could question what goes on in terms of data collection within our own organizations. What is appropriate? What is inappropriate? At our own university in Canada, a number of years ago, there was quite a protest about the amount of data that was being accumulated on intending students that had to do with their own family history. Queen's is one of those kind of traditional universities where people like to see their children go and their children like to see their kids go to Queen's, and it's one of those places, or it used to be. And people complain this is really unfair to make entry partly dependent on what your father did or what your grandmother did. And so people said, you know, this is inappropriate collection of data. This is a relatively trivial example, but it certainly was one that led to certain kinds of inequality in who was admitted and who was not admitted to be a student at Queen's. So, you know, we all work for somebody or other, even if we're only working, I don't know, in a restaurant or something. We tend to be employees of all sorts of organizations where we could be questioning the internal activities of the corporation or the restaurant or whatever it is. Parents can ask why there have to be so many cameras in schools. Students and faculty can ask why their university gathers so much data on students. Police officers can question why there are such concentrated efforts at crime prediction rather than having more contact with the local community. Of course, you know the answer to that question: reducing costs. It's such a strong incentive to go for digital alternatives to, well, in this case, policing. But can it not be questioned? Well, I think it can. So you don't have to be a celebrity whistleblower like Edward Snowden to ask awkward questions and to be a dependable truth teller. There can also be tactical and technical responses to surveillance. Think of the people who have been protesting for years in Hong Kong about the encroachment of Chinese restrictions, I mean, mainland China restrictions on life in Hong Kong. And the digital resistance that has taken place in Hong Kong has been quite striking. And the youth of the people protesting has also been very striking. It's a very young bunch of people who are protesting. The protesters in Hong Kong set up VPNs, or they used Tor, or you know, some other system. Signed up for Proton Mail, completely end-to-end encrypted system, and they used Signal. So there were so many ways that they were using means of limiting authorities' knowledge of what they were doing. They would even cover their ID cards in aluminum foil, leave their phones at home during a protest, so that the means of discovering who they were or what they were, where they were at a particular time, could be there. So everyday responses to surveillance are understandable, sometimes quite effective. People ask me frequently, I'm not a tech person, but they'll ask me about how they can protect themselves from negative surveillance. And there are many valuable anti-malware and protective systems available today, well, including aluminum foil and leaving your phone at home, to act prudently online. The Council of Europe has a digital resistance program, which aims to educate high school kids in careful and responsible use of the internet, which includes surveillance awareness. But, and I think this has to be a big but, and I think you'll understand it, the idea of protecting oneself has limits. Again, it's an individualistic approach. installing software to protect laptops, tablets, or phones often favors those with technical expertise to actually make the changes. They also have associated costs, which may not be, some people might not be able to afford some protection that they could use. So market solutions, in other words, solutions that you can buy, have a limited value. Better, I think, is to find ways of demanding protection for all. The Algorithmic Justice League that I mentioned the other day does just that. It works to make AI more equitable and accountable. But many technical and market offerings keep the conversation at the level of personal troubles rather than public issues. And it's always a risk. And then there are pressure groups. As I say, a number of you are lawyers. Let me tell you about some lawyers that I'm very proud to know. Way back in 2009, two young Polish lawyers, Katarzyna Szymielewicz and Małgorzata Szumanska, got together with some other lawyer friends. They were young, and they started something called Fundacja Panoptykon, so the Panoptykon Foundation, in Warsaw, to protect freedom and dignity in the context of growing surveillance. Okay, so they were hardly out of law school, and they wanted to do something serious in a country that they believed was allowing far more surveillance, both to be done by government departments and to be done by corporations. And they wanted to keep surveillance policies and practices in public hands. They're very democratically organized. And they do see some benefits of surveillance, like I do. Aspects of personalized service, for example, can be benefits to some people. But they worry that much goes on below the public radar. And today, where are we? 2024. After those years, they are now a steady government watchdog who people rely on for reports on what is happening in the corporations and in the surveillance done by police and others in Poland. So I met them very close to the beginning of the work that they were doing, and I saw them again in Poland last October. They're a great group, and I think others could take note of what they do. Okay, Panoptykon Foundation, if you want to check them out. And the last 20 or so years have seen rapid international growth and diversity among those groups opposed to surveillance overreach. In the United States, Electronic Frontier Foundation, Electronic Privacy Information Center are well known. Internationally, Privacy International is well known. I don't have time to tell you the story of Privacy International, but it's a really interesting story. The Australian person that started that never intended to found an international organization. And then there are people who work from a human rights point of view, thinking about surveillance. So there's a network of civil liberties organizations around the world called INCLO, international network of civil liberties organizations, and Human Rights Watch, which is also an organization that has surveillance concerns. And probably if you look in your own context, you'll find several. We have a number in Canada that I don't have time to mention. And they are developing in countries around the world. There are anti-surveillance groups, for example, in a number of African countries these days. And although they provide important modes of confronting surveillance in their own right, many groups are concerned with surveillance and have a larger remit to promote better policies, modes of regulation, law. And in a time of such rapid change, it might seem almost irrelevant to be working on such things, but I think that it's crucial to be working on such things because they do have a longer term life, likely. So seeking national and international modes of addressing the global explosion of surveillance is a vital and robust way of engaging the politics of surveillance. It might begin with updating old policies, privacy, data protection regulation, but also at developing new and up to the moment modes of limiting surveillance. So what does all this mean for the future? I'm just about to stop. What does it mean for the future? I've been talking about human-centered surveillance. I've been talking about human flourishing. I think one day I quoted the poet T.S. Eliot, who asked in the 1930s about where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge and the knowledge we've lost in information. And I asked the further question, where is the information that we have lost in data? And at the top of that kind of pyramid of ideas is wisdom. And I think that we should be seeking wise sources, not data-based sources alone, and certainly not informational sources on their own, or even knowledge-related sources. I think we should be working towards wise ones that involves what I've been talking about, ethics and appropriate political action and so on. What if human flourishing was the goal in which our hopes and fears for surveillance find a coherent context? If we had human flourishing as the big goal, the umbrella over what we're doing, wouldn't that make a difference rather than just thinking of it as lots of discrete little battles that have to be fought? Social trust, I've mentioned several times, includes an imperative for protecting privacy, protecting data, and there are concepts that we haven't had time to go into, like data justice. I think data justice is a really important concept. Algorithmic justice, closely related to it. And there are people working in these areas. Just check them out online. You'll find great resources among those who are working in these areas, especially by those who, among those who are the most vulnerable, which tends to be in relation to poverty, gender, blackness, and indigeneity. And what about the demand that digital rights be established, linked to the need for democratic participation in deciding how data collection, analysis, and use are governed? I think we're at a pretty critical point in relation to surveillance questions. There are a lot of areas where things seem to be running out of control beyond, apparently, the reach of government or movements. And I think in decolonial, post-colonial contexts, this is one tremendously important area, but it's right across the board, really. And flourishing demands that we treat everyone with dignity and respect, that we foster trusting relationships, not being satisfied with half measures, full communication, transparency, democracy, desirable, but their pathways to trust and accountability, and of course, the common good. And even trust needs to be associated with another concept. Trust assumes that there is trustworthiness. You can't trust something or someone if you don't think that it or they are trustworthy. So trust, even trust on its own, has to be put in the context of how we know that something or some person or some organization is trustworthy. Can we have an optics of hope today in relation to an area that tends to be overwhelmed by optics of despair, optics of resignation, optics of fear, so many optics about surveillance today, depending on your background, depending on your own socioeconomic position, your closeness to authoritarian government. So many things determine this, and it differs around the world. But is it possible to have something that is not just dystopian as we think about surveillance? How do we see surveillance? Some insist that surveillance is necessarily negative, always compromised with corporate greed or political power. Well, it is true that an awful lot of surveillance in the world today is compromised with corporate greed or political power. That is understandable, but I don't myself think that it can be the whole story. Because if our entire optics for thinking about surveillance has to do with such a bleak and miserable story, then how can you ever think about the possible alternatives to that? I think we need to have optics of hope rather than merely optics of fear and all the other things that I just mentioned. It's more difficult to find in a world of surveillance capitalism, especially, and of the currently rampant development in unregulated AI. I think it is more difficult, and I'm not pretending that it isn't. However, I do think that we need to be looking for new opportunities to find ways of curtailing, at the very least, the worst aspects of contemporary surveillance, and at best, trying to see how alternatives can be sought. And there may be alternatives. Some people are experimenting with platform cooperatives. They're similar to the regular large-scale tending to monopoly organizations called platforms. Cooperatives are possible, and there are people experimenting with platform cooperatives such that the services can be provided on those platform bases, but without what normally seems to go with the regular platforms. So ironically and perversely maybe, Bentham's panoptic plan proclaimed itself as echoing the eye of God. His plan was epigraphed, as I said, by words from a biblical song. Yet the primary mode by which the biblical eye watches is not moral control, but relational care. There's an Australian novelist called Tim Winton, and he has a novel called That Eye, the Sky. Short novel. The eye in that book is a kind of child's eye view of the world. And it's an eye that looks out for the disadvantaged, the discriminated against, the person driven to desperate measures. It's a far cry from many of today's surveillance systems, but it's an apt reminder that things can be different, that surveillance can be operating out of other origins, other impulses than those that dominate it at the moment. To see past the complacent assumption that surveillance is fundamentally serving the common good and anxious opposition to new technologies and surveillance practices is to open our eyes to other possibilities. If human flourishing is a priority, then something else than the dysfunctional, divisive, and discriminatory is possible. It calls for wisdom. It calls for human agency. But such potentials, I believe, should never be discounted. Surveillance can see and be seen in different ways. An optics of hope, however small at the moment, is available. So it might not be, that convincing, but it seems to me that the alternatives to stick with the optics of despair, fear, and all those other ways of seeing surveillance are quite inadequate for encouraging us to actually take action, and not just on our own, but together with others. So that's the message I leave you with, folks. And you can see that I've answered sort of your two questions in what I'd intended to say this evening. So great questions, though. And I'd love to hear what your other questions are. We can take a couple of minutes break, but I'd love to hear what your questions and comments are. In fact, what I really want to know, first of all, is what have you learned in the past 2 weeks? You've been very faithful in coming back again and again, and I feel very happy, and you know, I feel really good about the fact that you all kept coming back again, and I see your smiling faces each evening. But I'd love to know what it is that you came back for and why you bothered to come back. If you can tell me what you've learned and what you've been obliged to think about, maybe for the first time, I'd love to know. Okay, so that's an easy task. If you have a good question for me as well, then that's great too. But in the first place, I'd love to know what you got out of being here between 6 and 8 p.m. for the last 8 days. So let's take a break and get back to it. Let me hear what you got out of this course then, such as it is. You faithful people who've come day after day, what was it you learned? What had you not thought about before? What did you think about in a new way? What were you obliged to rethink? What was it that kept you coming back, apart from signing the little sheet that proves you attended? Don't tell me you're shy. No, okay, there you go.
Also here in clergy, but I think that at the front it's a call of action, and not only of individual action, but of political action through association with others. And even I think that the idea, I'd like to do, but the idea of the possibility of the surveillance of care is only possible if we can achieve this political action.
Mm-hmm.
Not only to keep surveillance in check, laws and regulations, that in Brazil we are making some steps, following the example of the EU, but also through formative policies, and not only in institutional level, but also community level.
Yep.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a perspective that I did not have on surveillance. I did not have much profound knowledge at all, and that is something that we turn my mind a little bit to
Good.
acknowledge. So that's
Good. That's encouraging for me. Thank you. I'm pleased to hear it, because, you know, this is one thing that I think we have to have as a strong message, that to reduce things to privacy, and then mean by privacy individual, is to limit the possibilities for action. And yeah, working together to try to understand, first of all, what kinds of surveillance are impinging on our lives, but then working with others to work out how we can make a difference in that world. You know, I was very privileged to spend, I don't know, 20 something years working with the Surveillance Studies Center and working with other people. And really, I think it's the only way forward. We were working with people from undergraduate students to senior professors. We were working with the agencies that were trying to limit surveillance, Privacy Commission in Canada. We were working with corporations sometimes and trying to understand their perspective and their approach. And in fact, we had quite an ally and still do have an ally in a very significant corporate leader. His name is Jim Balsillie, and he was the co-founder of BlackBerry Corporation. There's an awful film about him, but if you can see past the film portrays him as a kind of crazy, greedy, capitalist, corporate. Yeah, I didn't like the film at all. I've no idea what he made of it because I haven't talked with him since the film came out last year. But he was very, constructively helpful in the work that we did. And so I don't say no to any relationships with people who are willing to really confront the issues as they are, especially the urgent issues we've been talking about in relation to AI and so on. So yeah, well, I'm glad that's what you got out of it. Thank you. Others, let me know. Yeah, Julia.
But also as a concept that I can study and interact so closely to my daily life. And I think it's a thing that is hard to find and then also study as a scientist, but living in reality. And I was very curious about thinking good and humanistic about surveillance and see that the visibility that surveillance brings to us can also be a way to access basic rights and a better life. Because I was very skeptical about it.
Good. I'm also pleased to hear that. That's good. And so many of the things that I've talked about, have related to the possibilities of appealing to certain rights. And I think that that's an important basis that we can work on. And there's sometimes rights that are already established in some areas. So civil liberties and the human rights field generally. So yeah, but certainly going beyond the kind of individual and individualized approaches, I think, again, like the first question, is one that we need to keep addressing. So yeah, that's great. Other people? We're just talking about what we've learned over the last 8 sessions together. Yeah.
Much of what you said, most of what you said. So I would choose one topic specifically that I really had a very hard time swallowing the concept, which is
Internet citizenship. Okay.
Yeah. When I think about sharing data, especially personal data, and I told you, I think as a consumer, as an internet user, so not only as an individual, but an individual with a very specific relationship with the service that he or she is accessing. So, we or better. And what you brought is that not only is a person a user and a consumer, but he is a citizen. And then the person should be told that they are a citizen to see him or herself themselves that way, and take action. So again, call to action. So I thought that was really intriguing. And it was for me, and it's not obvious. I mean, it definitely is not obvious. We're users, we're consumers. That's really great.
Good. Yeah, I'm pleased to hear that too. That's great. You might be interested to know that the two people who wrote that book about, it's not internet citizenship, it's digital citizens. It's actually being digital citizens. So it's not even an abstract noun like citizenship. It's being digital citizens is the title of their book. And they are also two of the editors of one of the most important journals in this field, which is Data and Society. It's been going for, I don't know, 15 years now or so, but they have some great articles in there. So yeah, you might want to follow up with them. That's good. It's interesting, isn't it, how sometimes we have to not really understand what we think about something until somebody offers a concept that pulls it together, and you think, ah, that's what I've been looking for. And it sounds like that was a bit like your experience. And you know, my some members of my family and some of my friends, they tease me about what I do, and you know, I do work in theory, I do work in history, I do work in sociology, but it's very gratifying if you find that there are people who read what you write or listen to what you say, and they say, ah, that's the concept that I've been looking for to help me organize my other thoughts. So it's, you know, encouraging for me to think that there's still a role for this old guy. Other contributions? Yeah.
Say thank you for this opportunity. For me, it was really nice to have classes with you and also be here in this university. For me, it's very important. It was a nice opportunity. And thank you for everybody. This, and for me, it was something that I really liked to understand was the changes in the concept of surveillance. Because for me, it wasn't obvious that we had surveillance in medieval times, for example. So to understand how it changes and how we had surveillance in medieval times, and we also have surveillance in Gaza, for example, but they are different right now, and not only because of the technology itself. So it was something I had never thought about, and was very nice. Thank you for that.
Yeah, great, great comment. As you understand, I've always been kind of an historical sociologist of surveillance. Well, not always, but ever since the first book came out. Did I tell you that? I can't remember whether I did tell you. That first book that I wrote specifically on surveillance, I called The Rise of Surveillance Society. So in other words, it was supposed to be a history of the development of surveillance. And what you're saying, the changes to surveillance over modern times, is very much related to modern developments. And then my publisher, I think, thinking that it needed a kind of sexy title, They say, well, what about the electronic eye? And we'll have the subtitle for, no, your title can become the subtitle. And I was a bit skeptical about that because I was thinking it was an historical sociology. They wanted to have this. But subsequently, I've been grateful, A, because it helped me to think a lot more about the eye, and in so many ways now, I think the eye is important, and it's an important what's the word? I can't think of the right word, but it encompasses lots of other things as well. The eye is a metaphor, as well as a physical reality and sort of technological reality and camera surveillance and all that sort of thing. But I now think the electronic eye was a good title for it, even though I was really trying to write an historical sociology. And the piece that I'm trying to write now on the medieval, far too ambitious, but I'm going to do it. Again, it's very much an historical sociology. So yeah, so thanks for the encouragement with that. I won't forget that in a hurry. That's good. Okay, other comments, questions? Yeah, Lucas.
All the settings for blocking like cookies and like the ads, and like I thought it was for myself. I was doing and I wasn't like surveying me myself, but I didn't see that like if my mom goes and like use Instagram and like I have my Instagram and something like I'm related to her, it's for example my friends, so it's kind of like it's not my privacy, it's like a privacy as a group, not only like a right, not only but the people.
Good. Good. It's very encouraging for me to hear these things because it's a kind of basic sociological approach. One of the people that encouraged many people to read and think sociologically in the mid 20th century was a character called C. Wright Mills. And he has a little introduction to sociology. And in that book, he speaks about how personal problems become public issues. And that's really what sociology is all about. How that which you perceive to be an individual issue, you suddenly discover is a shared problem with other people. And I think it's a great benefit of sociological thinking to demonstrate that we are not on our own. We have issues in common with others that we share, and the action that can be taken in relation to these issues is not merely an individual action either. It can be a form of social action. Of course, it can eventuate in legal actions, changes in the law, new ways of legally restricting or guiding or, lots of words could be used there, the development of surveillance in different contexts. So good. I'm glad. I'm glad that was a benefit. Anyone else? Okay, where am I going to go? Yeah. Yep. Mhm. and in the social sorting area in particular, right? Yep. Good. And yeah.
Thank you, Professor. And one of the things that I've been really interesting about how technologies could not get developed for surveillance. But surveillance provides this technology useful for that. So that's, for example, the camera things were created for surveillance, but after it's surveyed with all those servers put in an TV, then you could survey an entire building with one person on a TV. So another thing that is a concept that I didn't know, but it was a very interesting concept, was about where entity was. You don't know how you can find ways of getting data science to get information from the surveillance techniques to try to predict crimes and other stuff. They can be kind of dangerous because sometimes prediction algorithms cannot work properly. They when make false decisions and can be very harmful to society. They sell it to research companies. If their decisions or to increase their data for analysis or their plans or to increase or to also increase their profits on the risk analysis of the population. And I don't know if I could ask a question about
Sure.
something that is putting up for an entire week and a half already. It's related to surveillance, and now they have shown about Snowden and it has mentioned it's about cryptography.
About
Cryptography, as I have researched it, about getting a thing that is making surveillance really hard. It's making surveillance hard. Countries like after the Snowden, they put all the SDX. It initiates the technologies mainly for personal use, like with their just for security and it makes harder to find telephotography. It's harder to find find the IP address and send the email. So my question, how do you see photography as a surveillance? Because it has been a very questionable thing in the US government as they have different things. It's a project but so the service that is really bad, like a photographer less humor because it was their own lives. This is not to make the government have access to these things. Things that they use is like how the government use them is just making companies the company is liable if their system was being used for activity. And they could not know because probably they couldn't know about the activity person was programmed.
Yeah, just I missed one word and it was quite important. What was the word you were using to describe the core of your question? I just, when you're saying, sorry? Okay.
How cryptography will make surveillance hard.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, okay, I think I've got a better idea now. It's, yeah, it's a good question. And thanks for the other comments that you were making too. Um, the the one thing that I hesitate about when it comes to, you know, um, those sorts of questions is that uh, it's the whole business of finding kind of technical solutions to supposedly technical problems. It may have a place, but if the corporation or the government department or whatever is really determined to do whatever kind of surveillance it is, then it's unlikely that they're going to agree to some cryptographic solution to the problem. So, you know, I think there are very helpful approaches that involve cryptography. I already mentioned, you know, the systems like VPN and you know, just using browsers that are more protective. There are all sorts of things that you can do in a technical way to just switch from one kind of system to another that is more secure. The problem is, in a world of surveillance capitalism, that those kinds of security militate against the very working model of surveillance capitalism, which is to maximize access to the data. So I think there are conditions under which it's worth, you know, turning to those kinds of solutions or approaches. And I do it myself. I mean, I vastly prefer Firefox to other browsers, for example, because they do care about how the data are handled. You know, I think if one is doing particularly sensitive things, then using Proton Mail or a VPN or whatever is a good plan. And it might work for you as an individual. Persuading large corporations to use cryptography in a more general end-to-end way is a losing battle at the moment. It's not going to fly. So yeah, it's a good question, and they're questions that are worth pursuing too. I'm not dismissing the question. I just think that what we're currently up against, not just in the corporate greedy and monopolistic desire for more and more data that they can use, that they have lifted off platforms on the internet for their benefit. We need other kinds of limits on those activities than can be provided by mere cryptography. I think that's what I'm saying. And that's why the much larger scale questioning of what's going on that should be happening at the, World Trade Organization, that is, the concerns of ordinary people are shown in that survey that came out today. Those are the issues that bother people. They're the things that people are concerned about, and rightly so. And I think we have to be seeking for, approaches to those problems that are, for one thing, involve coalitions of different actors, but include the possibility of legal restriction or legal guidance or legal limitations on those activities. And in the case of these surveillance capitalism corporations, it's a very tough call, especially when the governments, who may well be paying lip service to the idea of increasing protections for ordinary citizens and consumers, are actually entering into partnerships with those very corporations. We are at a difficult moment when it comes to that sort of thing. Good question. Thank you. How are we doing? Oh, we're kind of up to time. Who's got it? Yeah, go ahead.
Context of surveillance around history, or the thing that you said, like people would have any ideas but with a concept, they would believe that happened to. Like, but I think that how surveillance is present nowadays, people don't know. People have data. People think data studies, data science is the future, and they don't know these problems of
Yeah.
surveillance. I didn't know it so largely.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you. Federico.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you. Mostly because of I kept coming because of care preparing the classes. So thank you for that too. And I developed enormous respect for your stand on homeless criticism, since you are studying surveillance since at least my whole life. And anymore. And as my colleagues, I like a lot of points that I was showing to us. And I like to put some light on the privacy paradox, and mostly the idea of review selected data. That's currently something I'm talking with my mom frequently, that the information that she gets, even though it's churches and raw data, it's selected from other point of views and at least the mainstreaming channels of information.
Good. Good. Well. Go ahead.
I like a lot of one phrase that you said. It's very poetic in my point of view. You said you can use my words and my point of view as a toolbox to develop your own ideas. This is so important.
Yeah.
This approach and to be open. Also, Michel Foucault said this.
Yeah, you did.
Yes. But I would like to ask the professor, is a sociological approach this perspective of privacy as not individual, but the social and collective also, but also in the field of law? There are some thinkers, if you have this approach as fundamental rights, it's not just individual, but social and collective perspective. So just this, and also to think about surveillance in the sense of flourish people, to empowerment people, to think way out and forms of resistance.
And especially the empowering, because as I've stressed several times, it's frequently the most vulnerable members of society who are made more vulnerable by surveillance systems. And therefore the notion of empowering and of, yeah, just trying to find ways of re-dignifying lives that have been made undignified in that sense is hugely important. Yeah, it is a very important area of all that we have to say in this field. Yeah, thank you. Any others? Yeah.
Speech is that I could understand through my own sense a way of being in the world, like it's Meta or Israel, for example. They're not worried about who I am in the full of myself. They are worried if I am or a Palestinian victim or a consumer of certain group. Like they don't want my inner self. That's why we don't get the sense that we are being consumed or wrong. Like we are using social media. Like we don't care about much about me specifically. I don't care much about who gets access to specific parts of my personally, because I think that of me as an only individual irrelevant to the to the present government, to bigger scenarios, big companies, big governments, and it's that. I mean, it's not only about how TikTok or these apps know me, but they don't know me. They know what they want to know, like, for any specific yes, for a reason that it's profit or genocide, for example. And it has a lot to do with the context that these multiple individuals are collected, are part of a bigger whole. And that's it. Thank you for all.
Great, thank you. Good. Last call. Oh, you coming back for a second? Yeah, we've got someone who hasn't spoken.
But one thing that I really liked was the pace that was kept. I think you speak in a very clear way, which help us to understand the field a little better. For starters, technology is not a field that I like to study very much, but the way that you conducted that in all the classes actually helped me to be more interested about it. And was what made me actually come here on today. It was a new way to discover technology, because when I was thinking about this course, I didn't think of it in such a sociological way, but more in a technological way. And it was a nice discovery.
Thank you. Right. So did you want the last word, Sophia?
No, I did not. I wanted to ask you if I could still email you if I had, or if
Of course.
had any
Of
questions.
course. It applies to everyone. I already said there are a couple of email addresses that you can use, and you're more than welcome to if you wish to. Other people in the class have already emailed me as well, so you are welcome. How quickly I respond may depend on other circumstances, but I do try to answer all messages. Not all emails, but all actual messages from real people. You know what email accounts are like. They can be pretty problematic, but students, I always try to answer. So the answer is yes. Short answer. Okay, I think we should draw things to a close. So thank you for your company. I've really enjoyed being with you and hearing your questions and comments, and thank you for chatting with Sue too, because she's enjoyed being here. She's sat through more than one class that I have taught one place or another. I think I told you she was in the class that I taught at Birzeit University in Ramallah, and I think it was a great relief to the Muslim women in the group that she was there with me, because it made them feel much more relaxed. So yeah, we have been very happy to be here with you and meet you and hear your concerns. And I don't think I've ever spent so long with people who are mainly in law. So that's a good little, learning experience for me. So yeah, we are grateful and happy to have had the opportunity. That the initiative, I think, came from Paolo. And yeah, so okay, well, many thanks, and I'll look forward to your messages.
Thank you very much for coming, for inspiring our students. We can see we have good reason for being so proud of them. We are.
Yeah.
We are sure that your presence here was an important step in this process of building them as researchers and professors in the future, because you are a very, very special example of professor. So I would like to thank you very much for teaching us about this.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments a lot. Yeah, so thank you. I would say I have enjoyed it a lot. It's been a good experience for me. As you gather, I haven't taught a class right the way through for several years now, especially not every day. That's quite a shock to the system, but it's been good to be with you, and you've been very patient and long suffering with with me. So thank you for that. Okay, well. Oh, Sue had a question. She'd like to take a class photo. It's probably easiest to cluster people a little bit. Yeah.